Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Tonic podcast. Today, we're going to talk about an issue that is interesting, to say the least, the idea of mandatory or compulsory voting. This is the idea that maybe the government of your country doesn't force you, but says that all citizens inside of your population are required by law to vote. So, in this episode, we're going to look at the pros and cons of this idea and maybe talk about if this could be a solution for the problems and malaise that we're seeing in the United States right now. What's up, Drew? How's your day going, man?
It's going, man. I for those that don't know, I work in political media, and so this is just like the Black Friday basically of politics. So we're 3 weeks out of the election, and every day is a grind. But I'm happy to work, I mean, be a part of it, and it's just getting nuts. But I'm happy to be here.
I could imagine right now is insane. Like off the air, yeah, I mean, for weeks you've been saying it's just picking up, and so I bet you're going to be happy. Well, in some ways, happy on November 3rd or 4th. Kind of when things, at least in your department, slow down. There's going to be other chaos, but
Yeah,
yeah. So,
true.
but yeah. So what do you think about the idea of compulsory voting or mandatory voting? It's kind of this. I think it's something that's super weird in the United States, and just my initial takeaway would be that it wouldn't work in the U.S. because Americans are so obsessed with freedom and liberty, and they wouldn't like the government telling them that they have to vote.
Well, that's a pretty good hunch, right? I mean, I think that's a fair assessment of American like individualism and our distrust of government, right? I think a lot of Americans' gut reaction would be, I don't like being told to vote, even if I do or don't. I just don't like being told to. Um,
Right.
but yeah, it's a super interesting question overall. I remember, I don't know if you've tried this or if our listeners have, but there's an online like text based experiment game called Nation States. All you really do is like you make a nation state, you pick a flag, you make your name, and then it gives you like little political scenarios where you have to choose which way you go, and it affects the way your government is set up, and it can like you can boost your economy, crash your economy, all this stuff just based off of like simple political questions like this. And one of the very first ones that you get in that game, no matter who you are, is voting. Is voting going to be compulsory? Is it mandatory? And you can decide if it's mandatory, if it's optional, or if it's not at all, like no voting in your monarchy or whatever. But I always thought that was interesting that it's literally like the third question you get in that like nation state political science game, and it's because it's so it determines a lot about the political freedom and the civil liberties in your nation, and those two things are different. It's important to remember that like when people talk about freedom, it means the freedom to do what? There's economic freedom to gain capital and use your money and spend it. There's civil freedom and civil liberties like homosexual marriages, you know, equal rights under the law if you're disabled or a minority. And then there's political freedoms, and political freedoms are, do you vote in local elections? Do you vote in this thing or not or not? And so I think when people talk about freedom, it's important to recognize which ones we're talking about. And in this one is particularly, we're talking about political freedom. And in fact, in a way, mandatory voting limits political freedom, right? You don't have the freedom to then decide if you want to vote or not. But that cost could be to the benefit of society so that your democracy is more representative of the overall population. So that's ultimately the question in my mind is, are we willing to give up a little bit of freedom of choice for the end goal of our democracy and our represented officials, in theory,
Mhm.
represent more of the population? I'm more willing to give up that right? I'm more willing to give up the ability to choose if I vote or not so that our society functions better and more representatively. But many others might not be.
Right, and I think you bring up a really astute point there, and it's something that I guess would be the elephant in the room, and it's an interesting paradox kind of that I see in this is that obviously voting creates an open society that is limiting authoritarianism and is permitting individualism or freedom to express whatever you want, right? And ironically, if you force people to vote, I think you're going to think that you're losing some of your rights. But then at the same time, in order for a country to function, you almost need all of your populace involved. Like I almost think it's a similar problem to the consensus, where how are you going to have an accurate picture of how your country's working if only 50% of your population vote,
Yeah.
right? And like I do go back and forth on it though, because some of the criticisms, and these criticisms are from the Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. They say that like the leading one is that in places say like Australia, there's a lot of people that, well, okay, for context, Australia is one of the oldest countries that has compulsory voting. And I think there's a lot of positives to it. But one of the problems of, and this is a general criticism of this practice, is that a lot of people just fill out the ballot randomly because they know that they're forced to do it, right? There's no intrinsic obligation to actually vote how you want to, but you just need to fill out the ballot. But then at the same time, I've heard the counter one is that, if you have to vote, maybe you're actually just going to vote for what you believe in. So I don't know. Like I would need to see more, specific numbers on that case. But more specifically in the United States, like people were celebrating in 2018 when our midterm elections had what, like 50% turnout, and that's
Yeah.
considered historical.
That was good.
How do we gauge? Yeah, right. Like, and that's nuts to me, man. Because like, how do you actually gauge what the country needs when only 50% of them are voting? And I truly don't think that someone like Trump, or Brexit, or I don't know, the Vox part. Well, no, it's a little bit different. But Trump and Brexit are the two ones I would really think of. I don't think those would happen if everyone was voting.
Yeah, I mean, like Trump got like something like in the 30% of eligible voters, and then of those that actually did vote, so eligible voters that then went to the polls, he didn't even win the popular vote, right? We know that Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by something like 3 to 4 million. So yeah, I mean, maybe if you force people to vote, maybe that wouldn't have happened. Same thing with Brexit. Like the idea of Brexit only was approved by less than a majority of eligible voters, but eligible voters don't equal people that end up actually doing it. So yeah, maybe you fill that gap by promoting compulsory voting, and I think it's a good idea, and I think that we have to look at the practical application in Australia, because again, a lot of Americans especially hear compulsory and mandatory and they get freaked out. And you have these images of like, am I going to go to jail if I don't vote? And then no, if you look at what actually happens in Australia, no, that's not the case with compulsory voting. It's not a Gestapo holding a baton to your neck telling you to vote for someone. It's really just, hey, you know, you have to kind of fill out a reason why you wouldn't vote, and it has to be a legitimate reason, or you pay a very small fine. And we had looked at some links, and Australia has pretty small fines, and the Brookings Institute talked about their promotion of compulsory voting, and they said a fine would just be $20, but it would just be enough to get you to be like, yeah, I probably should go vote today, because it's compulsory. And that issue of like, well, then people would be writing in Donald Duck or whatever, like they'd be writing in Bugs Bunny. Well, yeah, okay, who cares? That person was a non-vote anyway before the hypothetical, right? It's either a nothing or it's a Bugs Bunny. But even if a couple thousand people write Bugs Bunny, the idea is that tens of thousands of people that wouldn't have voted before end up actually being like you said, that they get there and they're like, well, if I'm here, I might as well just throw, I might as well vote that guy. I guess he's cool. That's better than nothing. I mean, and again, the other thing is the concern is the people that don't vote in America aren't educated in politics and just don't care. And that's certainly true. That is true, right? There's plenty of people that aren't educated in politics, don't find the time of day to really care about it, and that for whatever reason, and that's valid. They just don't care about it. But maybe you do solve that problem if you have mandatory voting and that like strong sense of civic duty, that then you can foster a better culture around getting involved in politics. It's almost like, what goes first, the horse or the wagon? I don't know, but like maybe it is like you just get the wagon there and the horse, or get the horse started and the wagon goes along with it, right? Make voting mandatory, and maybe that low voter turnout culture will start to change.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. And kind of going off of that, like I think it was also the Brookings Institute article that talked about kind of how we need to kind of reimagine how we look at voting. And that's kind of what I full-heartedly believe as well, is that I think one of the problems, again, specifically in America, in terms of our democracy, is that we don't really have faith in our elections. So we're kind of suffering with a legitimacy crisis here in the United States. And I think it's about rewiring our psychology about how to deal with elections. That's kind of what you were saying. And I think mandatory voting in the United States would be crucial because you're starting at a different space. You're starting at, you don't have to opt into elections, you just have to opt out, right? Like, you don't have to worry about how am I going to register to vote. Instead, your dilemma becomes, do I pay a $20 fine for not voting?
Yeah.
And I think that really changes the whole psychology of elections. And also, like, I also think you were talking about, in the wagon before the horse and all this stuff, is that I also think that's a really good point too, is because the US is much older than Australia. And a lot of our early political ideas are from, the Lockean, the John Locke school of thought, which is individuals are held to, freedom from government, and government's only the watchdog. And so John Locke would obviously argue that government should not force people to vote, right? Like, I think that's a crucial part of Lockean philosophy. But instead, a lot of Australian colonies were influenced by late 1800s, early 1900s thought. And I think a lot of progress had happened since John Locke. And so some of these countries are more willing to, I think, go with it. And I wanted to go back to that website I was talking about, which is the Institute for Democracy and Election Assistance, and they have a list of countries that have been involved, in some form of compulsory voting. And there's an interesting thing about it, because there's over 20 countries that have done it in either the past or now, but about half of them have actually abandoned it. And I think that is something interesting to look at as well. Like, Chile abandoned it in 2012 after almost 100 years of enforcing it. And I don't know enough about why they maybe abandoned it, but it's also interesting. Cyprus, after almost 60 years, abandoned it recently as well. Let's see. Fiji abandoned it after almost 30 years recently. Guatemala abandoned it after about 30 years. Like, there's actually more countries that seem to have abandoned it than have actually embraced it recently. And I'm curious to see why that is. So yeah, I don't know. It's kind of interesting, but I think for me, maybe like a compromise that could be reached in this would be, especially in places like the United States, maybe we should just make it easier to vote. Because, right now you need to call local officials to figure out where to vote. You have to figure out how to register. Requesting a ballot's a pain in the ass. I've voted in every election since I've been 18, and I still had to go online and figure out if I'm still registered. Like, I think we're just looking at it wrong. We should have it so you're automatically registered to vote. Then you have to register to opt out of it. So I don't know.
Yeah, and again, I don't think the penalty should be big, or the reasons, like, you make it pretty lax, right? Like, obviously you have conscientious objectors, right? So if you have any religious reason that you don't want to vote or participate in democracy, right, that's totally fine. That's, protected by the Constitution, religious freedom, sure, of course. Or whatever, a disability, you'd make it. There's plenty of avenues to go if you really have a problem with voting. You shouldn't be burdened by it to the point of, like, any pain or financial whatever. I do also think that we need to make it a holiday, right? Don't put it on a Tuesday. Put it on a Saturday or a Sunday when most people don't have work, and those that do have work on weekends, make it a requirement that businesses give you a paid 3-hour lunch or something like that, so you can go to your polls and get it done. I think there's a lot we can do before we get to the conversation of mandatory voting to make voting easier, but that it goes along with it, right? Once you have a holiday, once you have a better registration system, once you have, mandatory voting is only then just a hop and a skip away. And then, you still have all these things that, like, if you really don't want to vote, if you really hate the system or whatever, and an anarchist, pay the $50 and then you don't have to vote. And there you go. You can post it on Instagram, like, and think you're cool. I'm just looking here at why Chile. I'm just looking just a quick scrape of why they might have stopped voluntary or mandatory voting. It looks like here, test of voluntary voting. The election was widely seen as the first test. This is from 2012 It's the first test away from mandatory voting. Under the old system, voters could be fined more than $200 U.S.
Ooh, yeah.
For
Okay.
failing to show up. A rule that caused many lower income and younger voters to refuse to register. So see that? So they weren't even registering at all because of the fear of the fine. That to me
Gotcha.
is like too harsh, right? $200 and you have to register on your own. Like you said, it should be you're automatically. I mean, if you're a U.S. citizen and you have a state ID or whatever, all the stuff, you get automatically registered. You get sent your ballot beforehand. That should already be taken care of. It shouldn't have to be on you. And then I don't think $200 it's too high for the same reason. Because if you do have someone that's I literally had to work or whatever that whole day. I forgot. Maybe you don't want to make it too hard on them. It's really just to foster an idea that this is important, right? To get our participation way above 50%. And for those that are still like, I don't know if I like the idea of the government forcing me to do something for civic service. Well, it already does. There's something called jury duty. I've had to do it. You have to do it. And now it's not as often as elections, right? Some people are like, oh, I've done jury duty 3 times. I've done jury duty once over 30 years, right? It's a little bit more random. But that's an example of something that we just culturally accept as a part of our society. At some point, you get called to be on a jury and it's part of our judicial system. You're the peers, the jury of your peers. You make that up. You do your service, and if you don't, you get paid like what, like $100 or something. Like there's places in there's things in part of the bureaucracy that allow people to have jury duty without too much financial detriment or scheduling issues, right? It's not radical.
Yeah. Oh, no, it's not radical at all. And I think that's the important step is that, especially countries like America, Canada, and the UK, just to name a few, I think we're really bad at this. And there's, like you said, there's so many steps that we can take before we even had to get to the idea of actually compulsory voting. And it was interesting. I was looking at a Pew article or research study actually that came out right before the 2016 election. And it was actually really fascinating because, I think that's kind of the efficacy problem of voting in the United States and a lot of Western democracies, especially English speaking ones like Canada and the UK as well, is that people think, well, I don't know about politics. My vote doesn't matter. And this Pew survey actually found that of the people that were unregistered, almost all of them said that if they had been given material and access to registering, they would have. Also, those people said that they felt like they would be more willing to look into politics if they knew that voting was easier, right? And
Right.
and I think especially with the US's history, we there is the elephant in the room is that I think we have crafted voting in this way due to racial issues in our history. Like I'm sure our listeners know I'm not out there waving an Antifa flag and just saying the whole system's broken, but there are parts of the system that are extremely broken. I think one of them is voting. And the late John Lewis, he talked about how voting, in quotes, is the access to equality in our democracy. Declared the size of your wallet, the number on your zip code shouldn't matter. The action of government affects every American, so every citizen should vote and needs to be required to do so. And I I do think that in a country like the United States, it almost would be important to change our system, require people to vote because there's so many people that won't vote. I remember working for campaigns in college, and when I had to go door to door, unfortunately, a lot of Latino communities, a lot of minorities would just slam the door in your face when you were trying to get their opinion. And it's because there's such a distrust in the system, not just from, Trump Republicans, but from a lot of minorities that really should have their voices heard. And it's just really a tough thing, but I don't even know where you would start with that because I mean, there's a report in The Economist from just this week where, what's his name? I think it's Greg Abbott in Texas. Yeah, I think it's Greg Abbott, right? He's there's a few counties in Texas where he's allowed only one voting drop-off box in the entire county. So there's an active fight against voters. I almost think that the United States has got to a point where actually less voting is better. But a crazy number is that Donald Trump, was elected with only a quarter of eligible voters. This is from The Guardian. Then only 37% of eligible Britons voted to leave the European Union. And so, Australia has super right-wing politics as well. they've kind of avoided some of these, sways and emotion and context, and they've kind of been inoculated against these polarizing policies in a lot of the U.S. and the U.K. And like, that's why I just think it would make a healthier democracy.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, a couple things like we do have to recognize that America has a history of not only like not embracing mandatory voting, but actively trying to suppress the vote of certain minority groups. I mean, if you look at history, right, with, you know, anyone that's been through an honest public education system will know that, like, the various Jim Crow laws and the idea that you had to take a voting test, right, to test your aptitude to vote. But then if you were white, you were grandfathered in, and then if you're black, you had to take it, and they're extremely hard. And to the point where even like political science majors take those tests from like the early 1900s in college, and we all fail. So there was active measures to try and suppress voting, and it's still going on today, like you said, in Texas. That idea of having only one drop-in box per county in Texas, and there's counties in Texas that have millions of people. That got struck down by a judge, is currently being fought in the courts.
Right.
You have felony purges, right, where some states will say, oh, if you're a felon, you can never vote again ever, even if you've already done your time. So there's different ways that, you're right, that there's a history of some politicians suppressing votes purposely. And we also know from information of emails and stuff that the Trump campaign in 2016, part of their campaign was to just discourage black people from voting at all. Not discouraging them from voting for Hillary Clinton, just discouraging them from voting, period. Because they understood that the black vote was most likely not going to go for Trump. So they wanted to just discourage voting in any way possible. So, yeah, not everyone. That's the thing. That's what's so crazy is, in my opinion, I'm like, to have a healthy functioning democracy, more people should be involved. And I think that's such a baseline opinion that's not based in any party, not based in any, just anybody. Everybody should get involved in our democracy. Well, not everyone thinks that. Some people literally do believe that some people should not be involved in our democracy. So that's a really good point. And then also what you said about Australia, about how they've kind of avoided some sorts of polarization because everyone has to be involved in politics. Back to that idea of Chile, I just read here that same thing happened. Well, the opposite happened when they went back to voluntary voting. Of the 13.4 million named on the election rolls, 5.5 million people voted, right? Less than half. And then check this out. Most of the abstentions were likely from people who just didn't care much about the election. In the new system, the people who vote are the hard line of both sides. And,
Yep.
and that's what
There
we're
we go.
seeing. That's what we're seeing. And we're seeing that happen so often in function in democracies around the world, but especially in the United States, is everyone's getting polarized. And maybe if you force people to be more active, and the people that are in the middle, but they're just not as vocal, if you force them to get active, maybe politicians will have to adhere to their needs more so than their radical polarized bases.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and that is what we are seeing right now. And I actually I'm sad I didn't address this when you mentioned it, but I think that's also a good point you had about 10 minutes ago now. It was about we need to make voting a national holiday, or at least put it on the weekends. Like, I spent 3 years in Spain, so I saw multiple elections because the Spanish government is in chaos. So they had so many new elections while I was there, but it's on a Sunday, and Spain is one of the countries that mandates voting, and so everyone votes, but they kind of turn it into a party. And I was reading that's the same thing in Australia, same thing in Argentina. Like these countries kind of turn it into a national day. Like, hey, let's go vote and then have a barbecue and some beers.
Yeah.
Like maybe that's also what's wrong with our democracy, is that it's become such a toxic like duty. Like, and I mean, I want to turn this maybe to a little bit more relevance involving the current election that we're seeing in I think exactly 3 weeks now.
Yeah.
Is that Jesus Christ? By the way, that's insane. But
Yeah.
I worry that we are going to see another fallacy, or not fallacy, failure in just our system, is that not all Republicans, but a big majority of Republicans are going to be voting at the ballots, and a big majority of Democrats are going to be voting by mail. And we're going to see, people have talked about the red mirage, where the day of the election, a lot of people are going to think that Trump won, but maybe Biden's ballots are going to come in and change that. But we're going to have to wait maybe weeks. But then there's also the problem of maybe a lot of Americans are voting for the first time, but they're also voting for the first time by mail. And what if they don't sign correctly? What if they are so freaked out about coronavirus they sanitize their ballot and it gets destroyed? Or there's so many things that could happen that I worry that could almost lead to a second term of Trump, just not because of election fraud, which Republicans talk about, but just because Americans just aren't prepared for this. And again, our leaders should have been preparing us for this.
Yes. Well, the pandemic has been around since March, and I do feel like the excuse of like, oh, how could anyone have predicted this doesn't work anymore. We've all kind of like, we're in a pandemic. Like, we should have been preparing when we know an election's coming up. We should have been preparing. Where it seems like, the head of the Postal Service has been doing the opposite, like dispreparing for it. But we'll have to see. That blue shift is certainly a thing. I don't think it's going to be super drastic to the point I don't like when you say a majority of Democrats vote by mail and a majority of Republicans. It's not like 80% majority. It's like in the 50s, right? So, you're still going to see a lot of votes come in from Democrats on election day, and you're still going to see a lot of Republicans vote by mail, especially older people. So, we'll see. It will be interesting to see how big that blue shift is, that red mirage, the vice versa of it, basically. So yeah, I mean, it will be interesting to see how that is. But again, I do think that I'm also interested to see in participation. Because you mentioned 50% of eligible voters in 2018. I would love to see that go up to over 60 for this election. I do feel that because of our political climate and the pandemic, even with the pandemic, that is, because of our political climate, I do feel that we are about to see a really high participation for the United States comparatively. Which I'm excited about. I think it's going to go up from 2018, but I'm interested to see by how much.
Yeah, because the phenomenon I feel like in 2016 was that you had all these Bernie bros that didn't vote because they were pissed at Hillary Clinton. Like, I mean, our generation, we're both millennials. I feel like a lot of millennials didn't vote in 2016. Like, I have conservative friends who didn't vote. I have progressive friends who didn't vote. And older people, hardliners, voted. I think that was almost the perfect example of just kind of an election where people lost their faith.
True.
And yeah, I do agree with you that a lot of even Gen Zers, is that what they are? The ones who are under us? I always forget.
Yeah, Gen Z, Zoomers.
Yeah, they seem, at least on social media and in the protests, they seem very politically active. So hopefully that turns into voting. And if any of them are listening, which I highly doubt, maybe they are to this, but vote. If you're going to go out on the streets and talk, vote as well, because it's crucial. And you can protest as much as you want, but at the end of the day, you need to also vote.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's the baseline civic duty of living in a democracy. And that's why I believe that something like compulsory voting is not that radical of an idea. To me, it's part of the social contract of like, hey, we have representatives that represent you, but part of doing that is you got to vote for them or vote for the ones you want. Like, it's like you have to participate in the system to receive the benefits from it, in my opinion, right? So whether that means voting or whether that means, paying taxes or working, right? Well, I guess working and then paying taxes is the same thing, basically. But, making sure you actually pay the taxes on the work you do, right? These are things that are like part of the social contract, and in my opinion, voting is part of it. And again, I'm totally fine if you show up to the ballot and you just put a big, smiley face on your ballot and throw that in the box. I'm fine with that. It won't get counted. If you want to conscientious object that way, I don't care. But at least it gets people to the polls, and you have to make that decision. Well, I'm already here. Do I still be angsty and put a smiley face, or do I actually just pick one of these boxes and check mark it and then go on with my day? And I think a lot of people would end up just actually check marking something that they, well, at least I align a little bit with this guy or this gal, and I'll just put that in. And that is so much better to me than just not voting.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I guess my closing thought is, I'll just hammer this home, is that we need to rewire our psychology. I'd rather opt out than have to opt in to vote. And I agree with you on the social contract. Like that's why for me it doesn't really feel tyrannical, because that truly is the basis of a contract of living inside of a vibrant democracy, even if we're maybe in our twilight. I don't know, but that is crucial. So I agree with you. I don't think there's really much disagreement between us on this one. And the thing is, I don't think a lot of younger people, especially conservatives or Democrats, really feel differently about this. I think this is an issue that I hope we can come together on. Maybe I feel like it's just the old establishment, especially on the right, is so against it, which is too bad.
Yeah, and again, I think it's also clarifying that it's not a gun to your head. It's literally
Yeah,
just like a small fine, or even like just fill out a paper that says why you can't. Like just don't get scared, right? Don't be scared of the idea of the government telling you to vote, because it's not like I don't want it to be a Gestapo.
exactly. Exactly. Well, yeah, it's going to be interesting. I think it's a relevant time to talk about this. I hope everyone, speaking of voting, oh, I don't care if it's at the ballot or in the mail. Um, I truly think that if you can vote in person, you should vote in person. It's just going to make the election day easier and maybe better numbers wise for whatever candidate you want. But yeah, check us out. We're obviously here on Twitch, on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Podbean. And thank you all for listening. It's been fun. And please let me know what you think about the handlebars. I might keep them for a while. So yeah.
Take care, guys.